Carl Jung spent his entire career studying the human psyche. And in all those decades of work, there was one type of person that genuinely puzzled him. Not the narcissist, not the neurotic, not even the psychotic. It was a specific kind of empath so psychologically rare that Jung estimated most therapists would encounter only a handful in their entire careers. These individuals didn't just feel deeply. They operated with a kind of psychological machinery that was fundamentally different from everyone around them, including other empaths. Jung called them individuated empaths, but the modern term that's emerged is super empath. And before you roll your eyes at that label, understand that Jung wasn't talking about someone who cries at commercials or feels sad when their friend is upset. He was describing a person whose consciousness functions on a completely different operating system, someone who perceives, processes, and interacts with reality in ways that are so unusual, so demanding, and so isolating that most of them spend years believing something is deeply wrong with them. The tragedy Jung documented was that super empaths almost never recognize what they are. They compare themselves to regular empaths and think they're just more broken, more sensitive, more dysfunctional. They don't realize that the experiences tearing them apart are actually markers of an extraordinarily rare psychological configuration, one that carries immense power if understood correctly, and immense suffering if it isn't. Today I'm going to walk you through the 8 specific signs Jung identified that separate the super empath from every other personality type, why each sign develops, what it costs the person who carries it, and why recognizing these signs in yourself might be the most important psychological discovery you ever make. The first sign is what Jung described as involuntary psychological absorption that goes beyond emotion. Regular empaths feel other people's emotions. That's well documented and relatively common. But super empaths don't just feel emotions. They absorb entire psychological states, complete with the thought patterns, physical sensations, and unconscious material generating those emotions. They don't just sense that someone is anxious. They temporarily inherit the architecture of that person's anxiety, the specific thought loops, the bodily tension patterns, the underlying beliefs fueling it. Jung noticed this in certain patients who would arrive at sessions carrying psychological material that clearly wasn't theirs. They'd describe thought patterns that didn't match their personality. They'd report physical symptoms that appeared after spending time with specific people and vanished when those people left. One patient told Jung she'd developed a sudden fear of financial ruin after dinner with her brother-in-law, a fear she'd never experienced before, and that dissolved completely within hours of leaving his house. She hadn't absorbed his worry. She'd absorbed his entire relationship with money temporarily. This happens because the super empath's nervous system doesn't have the standard filtering mechanism that keeps other people's inner world separate from their own. Where most people have a solid wall between self and other, the super empath has something more like a membrane. Information passes through, not just emotional information, but structural psychological information, the actual patterns of how someone's mind organizes experience. If you've ever spent time with someone and found yourself thinking thoughts that don't sound like you, feeling impulses that seem foreign, or experiencing physical symptoms that arrived with a specific person and departed when they did, this is what Jung was documenting. It's not imagination. It's a nervous system that absorbs psychological architecture, not just emotional weather. The second sign is pattern recognition, so advanced it appears psychic. Super empaths don't just read people, they decode them. Within minutes of meeting someone, they've unconsciously assembled a comprehensive map of that person's psychological structure, their wounds, their defenses, their manipulation strategies, their authentic self versus their performed self, and where the gaps between those two selves are most dangerous. Jung tested this repeatedly with patients he identified as super empaths. He would introduce them to colleagues or other patients briefly, and then ask them to describe what they perceived. The accuracy was unsettling. They would identify attachment wounds, family dynamics, and defense mechanisms that Jung himself had taken months of work to uncover. They weren't guessing. They were processing microdata, thousands of tiny signals in vocal patterns, facial muscle movements, energy shifts, word choices, breathing rhythms, and assembling it into psychological portraits that proved consistently accurate. But here's what makes this a sign of the super empath specifically. Regular empaths might get a feeling about someone, a vague sense that something's off. Super empaths don't get vague feelings. They get detailed structural information. They don't just sense that someone is hiding something. They perceive what's being hidden, why it's being hidden, and what wound made the hiding necessary. The resolution of their perception is extraordinarily high, and it operates constantly without their permission in every interaction they have. This is why super empaths often struggle in social situations that others find easy. A casual dinner party isn't casual for them. It's an overwhelming flood of psychological data from every person in the room. Data they can't stop receiving and can't easily discharge. The third sign is what Jung called the paradox of fierce boundaries alongside deep compassion. This is where super empaths diverge most dramatically from the empath stereotype. Regular empaths often struggle with boundaries. They overgive, over-accommodate, and lose themselves in others' needs. Super empaths do the opposite. They maintain boundaries so firm that people sometimes mistake them for cold or selfish. Jung found this paradox fascinating. The super empath feels more deeply than almost anyone, yet they're often the quickest to cut someone off, walk away from a toxic situation, or refuse to engage with manipulation. This seems contradictory until you understand the mechanism. Because super empaths absorb so much more than regular empaths, they learned early and through brutal experience that unprotected exposure to certain people could psychologically destroy them. Their boundaries aren't walls built from callousness. They're survival structures built from knowing exactly how much damage unfiltered contact can inflict. The super empath who cuts off a family member isn't doing it because they don't care. They're doing it because they care so intensely and absorb so completely that continued exposure would compromise their psychological integrity. They've learned, usually through devastating experience, that their compassion without boundaries leads to self-annihilation. Jung observed that this combination, extreme sensitivity paired with extreme boundary enforcement, was one of the most reliable markers of the super empath. If you feel everything deeply, but have also developed what others call a ruthless ability to walk away, you're not contradicting yourself. You're displaying the exact paradox Jung documented. The fourth sign is experiencing what Jung termed creative or transformative solitude rather than mere introversion. Many empaths need alone time to recharge. That's common and well understood. But super empaths don't just recharge in solitude. They transform. Their alone time isn't passive recovery. It's active psychological processing, where their consciousness does its deepest, most important work. Jung documented that super empaths in solitude would spontaneously begin integrating shadow material, processing collective emotional data they had absorbed, generating creative insights, and experiencing what he called active imagination, states where the unconscious communicates directly through images, feelings, and sudden knowing. Their solitude was productive in ways that went far beyond rest. This is why super empaths don't just prefer being alone. They require it with the same urgency that their body requires sleep. Without sufficient solitude, the accumulated psychological data from their absorption begins to backlog. They become irritable, confused, unable to distinguish their own thoughts and feelings from what they've absorbed. Their processing system is overloaded, and the only way to clear it is extended time alone, where the unconscious can sort, integrate, and discharge. If your alone time feels less like resting, and more like your mind is doing intense invisible work, if you emerge from solitude not just rested but fundamentally shifted in understanding, if being alone sometimes produces insights or realizations that seem to come from nowhere, Jung would recognize you immediately. Your solitude isn't avoidance. It's your consciousness doing what it was built to do. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fifth sign is what Jung described as an uncanny ability to detect inauthenticity that borders on the involuntary. Super empaths cannot tolerate fake, not because they're judgmental, but because inauthenticity registers in their nervous system like a wrong note in a symphony. It's physically uncomfortable. They feel it in their body as tension, nausea, or a crawling sensation that won't relent until they remove themselves from the source. Jung studied this response carefully because it was so consistent across every super empath he worked with. They could sit in a room where everyone else was charmed by a charismatic speaker and feel physically ill because they were perceiving the manipulation behind the charm. They could attend a family event where everyone performed happiness and leave with a migraine because the dissonance between performance and reality was so loud in their system that it became somatically unbearable. This isn't skepticism or cynicism. Super empaths often wish they could take things at face value. They watch other people enjoy performances that their own system won't let them ignore, and they feel isolated by their inability to participate in the collective agreement to pretend. They can see the strings on the puppet, and they can't unsee them, no matter how much easier life would be if they could. Jung found that this intolerance of inauthenticity extended to the super empath's relationship with themselves. They couldn't maintain their own false personas without experiencing internal conflict so severe it manifested as depression, anxiety, or even physical illness. Their system demanded congruence, internal and external, and the cost of performing a false self was higher for them than for anyone else, because they could feel the lie in their own body every moment they maintained it. The sixth sign is what Jung called the wound healer paradox, the compulsive drive to understand suffering at its deepest level because they've experienced it at depths most people never reach. Super empaths don't just encounter pain. They've been through psychological experiences so intense that they've touched what Jung called the archetypal layer of suffering, pain that goes beyond personal experience and connects to something universal. This isn't about having the worst trauma or the hardest life. It's about processing depth, the same event that one person experiences as difficult and moves past. The super empath experiences at every layer simultaneously. The personal wound, the family pattern it connects to, the collective human theme it represents, and the archetypal meaning underneath all of it. They process vertically, where others process horizontally. Jung documented that this depth of processing created people who understood suffering in ways that were almost uncanny. They could sit with someone in the worst moment of that person's life and remain completely present, not because they'd learned therapeutic techniques, but because they'd traveled to those depths themselves and knew the territory. They didn't flinch at darkness because they'd already mapped it internally. But this depth carries a cost. Super empaths often experience periods of what looks like depression, but is actually deep psychological processing. They're integrating material at levels that their conscious mind can barely track. They go through seasons where the weight of what they're processing makes normal functioning difficult, not because they're broken, but because the work their psyche is doing is genuinely massive. The seventh sign is trajectory perception with painful accuracy. Super empaths don't just read the present moment, they perceive where things are heading. They see the early signs of relationship collapse, career implosion, health crisis, or personal breakdown in people around them, often months or years before the visible evidence appears. Jung found this particularly documented in the way super empaths experienced romantic relationships. They would know within the first few encounters not just who someone was in the present, but who they would become under stress, how their wounds would eventually surface, and whether the relationship had a genuine foundation or was built on mutual projection. They could see the entire arc of the connection while still in its opening chapters. This creates an agonizing kind of loneliness. You're watching something beautiful begin while simultaneously perceiving its ending. You're investing in a friendship while your system is already showing you the moment that friend will betray you. You're starting a job while perceiving the dysfunction that will eventually make it intolerable. Most super empaths spent years trying to override this perception. They told themselves they were being negative, paranoid, or self-sabotaging. They forced themselves to ignore what they saw and hope for different outcomes. And every single time, their original perception proved accurate. The relationship ended exactly how they sensed it would. The friendship fractured along the fault line they'd detected from the beginning. The job collapsed in precisely the way their system had predicted. Jung emphasized that this wasn't pessimism or self-fulfilling prophecy. He verified it. Super empaths were perceiving actual developmental trajectories based on structural patterns they could detect, but couldn't always articulate. They were reading the code running beneath the surface and projecting its inevitable output. The information was accurate. The problem was that no one, including the super empath themselves, wanted to believe it. The eighth and final sign is what Jung considered the most defining characteristic of the super empath, and it's the one that surprises people most. Super empaths possess what Jung called integrated darkness. They have not only acknowledged their shadow, but have done significant work to incorporate it. They know their capacity for manipulation, selfishness, rage, and destruction, and they've chosen not to deploy those capacities while remaining fully aware they exist. This is radically different from the empath who identifies as purely light, purely good, purely giving. That empath is operating from a split psyche, where the shadow is denied and projected onto others. The super empath has moved beyond that split. They know they're capable of everything they perceive in the people who've hurt them. They've faced their own narcissistic tendencies, their own manipulative impulses, their own capacity for cruelty. And that confrontation didn't destroy them. It completed them. Jung considered this the most significant marker because it indicated genuine individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole rather than psychologically split. The super empath doesn't need to see themselves as the good one in every dynamic. They can acknowledge their own darkness without being consumed by it. They can say, I understand why someone would do that terrible thing, not because they're making excuses, but because they've found that same impulse in their own shadow and integrated it rather than acting from it. This integrated darkness is also what gives the super empath their power, because when you've faced your own capacity for destruction and chosen differently, your compassion isn't naive, it's informed. You're not kind because you don't know how to be cruel. You're kind because you know exactly how to be cruel and have made a conscious choice not to be. That's a fundamentally different kind of goodness, one that carries weight, because it emerges from awareness rather than ignorance. Jung warned that this integration process was what most people who identified as empaths avoided entirely. They preferred the identity of the sensitive, loving, light-filled empath because it protected them from confronting their shadow. But the super empath had gone through that confrontation, willingly or through circumstances that left them no choice, and emerged as someone whose empathy was grounded in wholeness rather than in denial. So here's what these 8 signs collectively reveal. The super empath isn't a superior empath. They're a different category entirely. Their absorption goes deeper. Their perception resolves finer. Their boundaries are harder. Their solitude is more productive. Their authenticity detector is more sensitive. Their processing reaches archetypal depths. Their trajectory reading is more accurate. And their shadow integration is more complete. Each of these characteristics developed because their nervous system and their life circumstances demanded extraordinary adaptation. If you recognized yourself in most or all of these signs, you're probably experiencing a strange mixture of relief and grief right now. Relief because someone finally described your experience accurately. Grief because you now understand the full scope of what you carry and why it's been so isolating. Jung would tell you that recognizing what you are is the first step toward using it, rather than being used by it. Every characteristic that's caused you suffering exists because it was serving a function, protecting you, processing for you, perceiving for you. The suffering came not from the abilities themselves, but from not understanding what they were, from trying to suppress them, or from deploying them in service of others while neglecting yourself. The super empath who understands their own configuration stops being overwhelmed by it. They learn to manage their absorption consciously. They trust their pattern recognition instead of overriding it. They honor their need for solitude without guilt. They stop apologizing for their intolerance of inauthenticity. They accept their depth of processing as valuable rather than pathological. They act on their trajectory perception instead of hoping it's wrong. And they continue integrating their shadow, knowing that wholeness, not goodness, is the actual goal. Jung believed that super empaths, when they finally understood and accepted their configuration, became some of the most psychologically powerful people alive. Not powerful in the sense of dominance or control, but powerful in the sense of clarity, discernment, and an unshakable relationship with truth. They could perceive reality with a resolution that others couldn't access. They could navigate human psychology with precision that looked like intuition but was actually sophisticated processing. And they could hold space for the full spectrum of human experience, light and dark, beautiful and terrible, without needing to collapse it into something simpler. That capacity to hold complexity without flinching, to see everything and still choose to engage with life, to carry extraordinary perception without being crushed by it, is what makes the super empath genuinely rare. Not everyone who feels deeply qualifies. Not everyone who calls themselves an empath possesses this configuration. But those who do know, somewhere beneath all the confusion and exhaustion and isolation, that what they carry is significant. Jung spent his career confirming that knowing, and if these 8 signs described your experience with uncomfortable accuracy, consider that confirmation extended to you. Your configuration isn't a disorder, it's not a curse, though it often feels like one. It's a way of being conscious that demands more from you than what's demanded from most people. More processing, more solitude, more honesty, more shadow work, more boundary enforcement, more courage. But it also gives more depth, more clarity, more genuine connection when you find people who can meet you at your actual level, and more capacity to navigate a world that desperately needs people who can see clearly, even when clarity is painful. That's what Jung meant when he documented the super empath. Not a label to collect or an identity to perform. A recognition of what you actually are so you can finally stop trying to be something you're not and start working with the extraordinary equipment you were given. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.